So we're going to start off today with a question. And for the next little while, we'll be starting off with the same question. Here's the question. How have Jesus followers changed the world? How have Jesus followers changed the world? So for some people, it might be a real question, like, have Jesus followers changed the world? We're going to be talking about his first followers. How have they changed the world? And then his followers after that, all the way down to us today. How have they changed the world? One of the problems here is actually that they've changed the world so much that it's like a fish in water. We are constantly swimming in the change that they have made, and so we don't even recognize it for what it is. So let's start off thinking about what it was like to live in the world before Jesus. And we're going to do that with some quotes from one of the greatest role models of the ancient world before Jesus, just a little bit before Jesus, a guy named Julius Caesar. Let's have some quotes from him. You guys heard of Julius Caesar? Give a round of applause. Is he one of your big role models in life? Probably not. Probably his most famous quote is, "I came, I saw, I conquered," right? Which is basically saying, I'm the best. That's his most famous quote. I'm better than everyone else. Okay, here's another one. This is a great one. One day he was riding through the Alps with his generals. And he comes on this little tiny village of barbarians. That's what they called everybody else who wasn't Roman. You're not Roman, you're a barbarian. It was a derogatory term. And his generals start making fun of these barbarians. These guys are idiots. They don't know anything. They have no technology. We could kill them all immediately if we wanted to. And Caesar looks at his generals and he says this. He says, "I would rather be first here than second in Rome. I would rather be the greatest man in this tiny little village you guys are making fun of than be second in the city. It's the biggest city that's ever existed in the world up to that point. Over 1 million people in Rome." Okay, what is Caesar saying here? It's all about who's number one. Who's number one, right? I've got to be better than everyone else. That's what's important. Here's another one from him. One time, he is reading a book. So his generals are kind of with him and they're observing him. He's reading a book about Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great lived like 300 years before him, had conquered a huge part of the world by the time he was in his early 30s. And Caesar at this point is in his early 30s, and he's reading this book about Alexander the Great, and he stops reading for a while, and he gets real focused, and his generals are kind of watching him like, what's going on here? And then all of a sudden, he bursts into tears and starts weeping uncontrollably. And they say, "What's wrong with you? What's wrong?" And he says this. He says, "It is a matter of great sorrow that while Alexander at my age was already the king of so many peoples, I have as yet achieved no brilliant success." This is how ambitious this guy was, okay? Total self-centered ambition. Let's go to one more, just so you can get a full flavor of him. This is his advice to young aspiring men, his advice on whether or not you should follow the law. Okay, here it is. If you must break the law, okay, so we're going to assume there are some times when you must. If you must break the law, do it to seize power. In all other cases, observe it. Okay, now it's kind of funny. We might laugh and we think, all right, Julius Caesar, here he was. He's kind of a jerk. Obviously, he's a self-centered big baby. We would kind of laugh at some of these statements and say, man up, get real here, Julius Caesar. But here's the thing. Here's the thing that I want to get across here. All of these were written down for us in Plutarch's Life of Caesar. Okay, which was written only about 50 years after he died, and it was written for the purpose of showing people how great Caesar was and helping them to follow his example. You see this? These are not, to us, these statements are laughable. They are things that anyone who thinks this way is an idiot, right? No, this was ancient morality. This is how you should be. If you were so ambitious that you were crying like a baby because you hadn't yet conquered the world by the age of 35 or whatever it was, okay, that was a great character trait. You were awesome. Now think a little bit further with me. How did this play out? The most concrete way for us, I think, to wrap our heads around what it would have been like to live in this kind of a society, okay? What that produced in people was things like this. very common practice for Romans whenever you had a memorial service for someone, or whenever you had, whenever like your son turned 10. What do we do when we have a child who turns 10? We have a party, right? Well, they did too. So here's what they would do at their parties. This is how it all began, things like the Colosseum. Your son turns 10. You want to show everybody how great your son is and how great your family is. So what you're going to do is you're going to buy a bunch of slaves. And you're going to have those slaves fight each other to the death at your 10-year-old's birthday party. You see how vastly, like we can't even contemplate this. Imagine Andrew turns, try to imagine yourself in this kind of a culture. Andrew, my son, turns 10 in a couple of years. Imagine we had a fight to the death of a bunch of poor people that we gathered in the parking lot of the church out here. And we watch them and we cheer and we egg them on as they literally kill each other. Because it's a great thing to prove how much better you are than other people. That's the kind of culture that pervaded the world before Jesus and his followers changed it. Okay, have Jesus and his followers changed the world? Oh my goodness, right now every single one of us is living, I know the world is still full of evil and darkness and there's all kinds of bad stuff, but we are living a dream compared to what was then. At least now when these things happen, we see them for what they are and we call them evil. Back then, they cheered them on. Jesus and his followers have changed the world. We're jumping into a sermon series this week, and it'll go for 7 weeks up until we start into Christmas time. And this series is called Living in Community, Change the World. There's a lot of talk about changing the world. There has been for a long time. The question is, how exactly can you do it? How exactly can we change the world? There's lots of bad stuff in the world and we want to change it. How can we do it? What this series is going to be about is what exactly was Jesus' strategy to change the world? What was it? How did they do it? The picture that you've got on your screen or that you've got in your bulletin on the title slide, you see this small group of people sort of in the darkness on a hillside or in a field, right? This is an image for us of Jesus' first followers. They were not really anybody. They were nobody special. They were in a world of incredible darkness that we can't really even relate to. And their plan was to change the world. Jesus was going to use these ordinary people to change the world. How did he do it? What was his strategy? His strategy had to do with deep relationships. It had to do with deep relationships. Today's message, the title will be Community That Changes Lives. We're going to look now at our key verse, and this will be a key verse for the entire series. This is John 17, and these are words of Jesus himself. I don't know if I actually have it up there. Do I have John 17 up there? John 17:23. Jesus says this. He's praying for all of those who would believe in him after. All those who would come to believe in him later on. So us, he's praying for us. And this is what he says. And he encapsulates what his strategy to change the world is right here. May they, so us, those who would follow him, experience such perfect unity that the world will know that you sent me and that you love them as much as you love me. May they experience such perfect unity that the world will know that you sent me and that you love them as much as you love me. So Jesus' strategy was actually people. People united in a particular way that would then be able to create new kinds of communities that the world had never seen before. And that was his strategy to change the world. His strategy was not. Notice how Jesus never wrote a book. He never wrote anything down, except maybe that one time he was drawing in the sand and then he erased it right afterwards. He never wrote a book. How many people today think the strategy to change the world is to write a book? Jesus never, not that that would be no good. I'm not saying that at all. Books have done great things, but that wasn't his strategy at all. He abandoned that. His strategy wasn't to get as many people close to him as possible. It wasn't that. In fact, lots of people were drawn to him. He often did what? Ran away from them. He would not entrust himself to the crowds because he knew what was inside human beings. His strategy was to create a new kind of community that by the power of God would actually transform the inside of a human being within that community and then enable new communities to do the same thing. And in this way, he would take over the world. So your first point that you can write into your bulletins is this kind of key point for the whole message today. Jesus builds a community around him that changes lives and then changes the world. And it actually succeeded and is still succeeding. So if we want to figure out how to change the world, this is the guy. Jesus is not only the Son of God, he's not only the most morally perfect human being who's ever lived, he's the smartest human being who's ever lived. He knows how to do it. And he's still doing it today, actually. So we're going to look at a couple of pieces. First, we're going to take a look at Mark chapter 3. And in Mark chapter 3, Jesus is forming this first group. And I'm going to say Jesus is forming a community group. That's how I'm going to describe it here. Now, in our church, we are a church of community groups. Our church's purpose is to help people grow in their relationship with God and with each other. And in fact, really the primary way we do that, Sunday morning, where we're at right now, is a very important place and time for our church. It's a time we set aside as holy, but it's not the central aspect of our church, our community. The very most basic central aspect of our community is our community groups, which most of you are part of. We have something like 80 to 90% of our regular people, regular attenders, in community groups, which is amazing. Good job to you. Keep going. Jesus here, we're going to talk about what actually is a community group and what is the church, right? Church is not a building, the church is the people, but not just the people formed in a certain way, a very intentional way, according to Jesus' plan. And that's what our community groups are for, to keep on carrying out his plan. So we're going to watch as Jesus forms a community group, and then we're going to see what he does with his community group once it's been formed, how that transforms people's lives, the lives of those who are in it, and then how he begins to send out that community group that he forms, and how it begins to build other groups. So let's take a look at Mark chapter 3. That's where we're going to start first. And I see my slide maybe is mislabeled here. That's okay. Don't worry about that. This is actually Mark chapter 3. So here's what it says. So Jesus spent the whole night in prayer. This is what he does. This is near the beginning of his ministry. He had started wandering around, healing people, trying to help people. And then he spends a whole night in prayer on this little hill that they would call a mountain. I don't know why, because they didn't live in British Columbia. Things were smaller there. And so he called this little hill a mountain. He went up on this mountainside, and he spent the whole night in prayer. And then he called particular people to him. So it says Jesus went up on a mountainside, and he called to him those he wanted, and they came to him. He appointed 12. Now listen carefully. There's some purposes for which he appointed them. He appointed 12 that they might be with him, that he might send them out to preach and to have authority to drive out demons. And these are the 12 he appointed. Simon, to whom he gave the name Peter. Gave him a new name. He was really good at that. James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John. To them, he gave the name Boanerges, which means sons of thunder. Andrew and Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. So Jesus begins by forming this community. He builds a community group. He's got a whole bunch of followers that have people who have been attracted to him, who are interested. But he goes away and he talks with God, his Father, and he tries to figure out who exactly should I choose to be the closest to me. And then what he does is he pours a whole bunch of his life, time, and energy. In fact, the main portion of his time and energy, he pours into just these 12. He has them doing all kinds of work, and he's still involved in a public ministry. But what he's doing is building deep relationships with them and having them build deep relationships with each other. And this new group is the group that's going to change the world. There's all kinds of imagery going on here as well, right? We're not going to get too deep into that, but those who were there would not have been lost on the imagery that he's going up on a mountainside, just like their forefather Moses had gone up on a mountainside, right? And he's picking 12 people. What does 12 remind you of if you're a Bible student, which all of these guys were? 12 reminds you of the 12 tribes of Israel. So he's creating a new people, a new kind of nation, if you will, but not one based on an ethnic group anymore. And you'll see that in a minute. This is a very, even though at this point they are all Jewish people, this is a very diverse group of people that he calls together. And that's part of his point. That's part of his purpose. So he calls them together, and they are going to be with him. They're going to spend intentional time with him, lots of it. And he's constantly taking them on prayer, all-night prayer meetings, and he's constantly taking them on retreats to get away from people. And then they're with him. They watch him work. They watch him do his ministry. And then he begins to involve them in doing some of the work. So he's praying for people and helping people, and he's healing people of diseases, and he's changing people's lives, and then he begins to involve them. And then he talks with them about it. See, lots of other people on the outside are hearing his teaching and not fully understanding it. It's going to take them a long, long time if they ever do understand it. But for those on the inside, this is how Jesus talks all the time. There are those on the outside, then there are those who are already on the inside. And for you on the inside, I'm going to explain everything. You're going to be with me. You know me enough to know what I'm doing. And then the parts you don't understand, I'm going to actually explain to you. This is why I did that. This is why I did that. Oh, Jesus, why did you that time you prayed for a guy and this other time you kind of, rebuked him and told him that he should be changing his life. How did you make that decision? How did you know that that's what this guy needed? That's what this other guy needed. How are you praying, Jesus? They're watching all of this stuff that he's doing all the time, and he's explaining it to them. Not only that, these guys are a very diverse group of people. Jesus does not choose a bunch of people who are like himself. And in fact, as we look through the list of the apostles, that's what these guys become known as, because apostles means those who are sent out, and he will eventually send them out. As we look at this list of the apostles and what we know about these guys, he has chosen people who would never naturally be friends. Some of them would have. He chose some of them were fishermen from the region of Galilee, but really that's just about 4 of them. Then we've got guys from Galilee, which is kind of a really conservative area. We've also got guys like Matthew, right? And Matthew in that list is what? Matthew is shout it out if you know it. He's a tax collector, right? And so a tax collector is somebody who had actually betrayed the nation of Israel and colluded with the Romans, who they all hated. And so this was a guy who totally would not have fit in this group of fishermen from the backwoods, where it's really conservative. Not only that, he's got another guy in here, Simon the Zealot. Right, and this is probably the strongest division that would have been in his early group, at least the strongest political division that we see, is that Simon the Zealot, that group, the group of zealots, these guys were a force who wanted to physically, like military, fight the Romans. So you've got a guy who allied himself with the Romans, betrayed the nation, and you've got another guy who's ready to go to war, and basically a terrorist group, and fight the Romans with guerrilla warfare. And you just put them in the same room. In fact, they're going to live together now. Now, what would happen if most of us tried that? If we took 2 people like that, right? We take I don't know, a terrorist and, a conservative American, and we try to live with them in the same house, right? What would happen there? Yeah, probably not a good result. But Jesus is different than us, and he knows how to do this. We can see in his group there actually was a lot of fighting and squabbling as they go on, and he's chosen not only a group that's diverse politically, not only diverse in the way they've chosen to live their lives, but he's chosen a group that's very diverse in their personalities as well. Do you ever wonder why you can't find a church that's full of people just like you? Do you ever wonder that? Do you ever wonder why every time you go to, actually it's not just true in church, it's true in all kinds of human groups. You're at work or other groups that you're a part of, there's always that person. They're always there. You leave one group, you run away from them to go find a new group, and they're there again. It's a different person. But same challenge. This is because God is actually sovereign. He's actually in control over the world. He's trying to unite extremely diverse people, because when that happens, that's where a lot of the power comes from. You see? So in this group, he chooses intentionally a bunch of people who are way different and never would have naturally been friends, and he teaches them to live together. He teaches them to live together, to have the same mission together, to work together. Eventually, what will happen, he does his work so well that by the time we get to the end of the story of Jesus physically on earth, by the time we get to the end of that story, these men have been transformed, especially after his resurrection, into a group who not only will die for Jesus, but would also die for each other. They are a group that is so deeply united that they would die for each other. And it's because of that deep unity they have in God, in Christ. That deep unity is actually what demonstrates to the world the truth of what they're saying. So this is what he creates, and it works. Let's take a look at Acts chapter 4 and verse 13. And this comes from a little while after Jesus was no longer physically present with them. He'd gone away, and now they're trying to run things on themselves. Peter has kind of taken up leadership, and the early church, the early group of followers of Jesus is growing. And some of these ones who were the first ones who were with Jesus, they end up in front of a court in Jerusalem, right, in front of this court. And Peter gives this amazing speech to the courtroom. And everybody's kind of stunned by this speech. And this is what happens right after the speech, Acts chapter 4, verse 13. So it's talking about the high officials of Israel, who, when Peter and his friend John first walked into the courtroom, they probably thought, oh, these guys are easy pickings. Right, these guys are uneducated fishermen from the backwoods who know nothing. We're going to, we're going to hammer these guys, and we're going to tell them what's real, and we're going to punish them if we need to, and this Jesus movement is going to die. Peter gives a speech that grabs hold of the whole crowd, and the leaders don't even know what to do with what he's just said. They're stunned. He's taken control of the room without even really trying. And it says, when they saw the courage of Peter and John, and they realized that they were unschooled, ordinary men, they were astonished. And they took note that these men had been with Jesus. This famous verse. They recognized, even in that moment, that these guys now look like that other guy that we couldn't deal with. That other guy who was from the backwoods that we couldn't handle, that we couldn't corral, that we couldn't control. He's gone. We killed him. And all of a sudden, these other guys are just like him. They have this same kind of spirit that he had. They have the same kind of power that he had. And we can't control them either. We can kill them. And in fact, they eventually will kill all of these guys. All of these apostles except one. They eventually will kill them all, but they cannot control them, and they cannot stop their movement, which has begun to take over the world. So let's pause there for a minute, and let's just say, so we're talking about Jesus, talking about his ability to create a community, a group that's so deeply connected in him that it will actually change the inside of what those people are like within that community. And that then through that, somehow he's going to change the world. That's the vision here that I'm trying to paint for you. This is the vision that Jesus has painted. Okay, but let's ask the question. So it worked for them. It worked for Jesus. Can this kind of thing work today? Does it work today? And the answer is yes, it does, when it really is put into action. I'll give you one example from my life that just stunned me. This was a number of years ago at another church, and a bunch of the church staff and leadership decided to go through what we called at that time an intensive. And what we did was we were people who went to church and we read our Bibles on our own, and we did a bunch of the things that we were supposed to be doing, but we were all had our own struggles in different areas, things that we were stuck with and couldn't get past. Have you ever experienced that? You try to follow God and you're trying to do the things that you should be doing, but there's some area where you just get stuck and you cannot move past it. And sometimes you're stuck there for years, decades, your whole life maybe. Okay, so we were those kind of people. And what happened is we did this 30-day, it was just planned it for 30 days, and we were going to see what happened. We spent a ton of time together during those 30 days. Actually, the point was to try and maybe replicate, not in its exact features, but some of the stuff that Jesus did. So we spent a ton of time in prayer together. We spent a ton of time just hanging out together, talking together, eating together. We spent a ton of time doing other spiritual disciplines together, reading our Bibles together, meditating on Scripture, a bunch of things that we built into that. The key was that it was together. A lot of these things are things that a number of us had tried on our own. And here's what happened during that time. Problems that people have been stuck with for years and years, many of them, not all of them, but many of them just simply went away during that time. It was unbelievable to us what happened. One person who had been, we'll start off with an easy one. One person who had been stuck, have you ever been stuck with this? He drank too much pop, okay? And that seems like a simple thing. He drank too much pop and ate too many potato chips. He had struggled with this for like 15 years, okay, on his own. All of a sudden we started this and he just simply stopped and it was no problem. It was just done. It was just gone. Another person who had struggled with anxiety and depression and a whole bunch of other things in her marriage, all of a sudden during that time, it was like she came alive. She was able to step out of those things. It wasn't like her life became perfect immediately, but it was a dramatic, remarkable change. And this same thing happened in almost everyone who was part of that group. And then here's what happened afterwards. We stopped because it was really intense and we couldn't keep that up more than 30 days anyway. And almost every problem came back at the end of that time. Almost every problem came back at the end of that time. So why is it sometimes that we struggle, we try to change things on our own, but we are stuck for long periods of time? Jesus' strategy to defeat these things, to change the inside of a person, is he forms a community group. And that's why we have these things in our church. That's why we have these structures in place. This is his strategy to do it. Is actually his strategy to take over the world. It's not an army. It's not a book. It's not becoming super popular. In fact, he tried to avoid that as much as he could. His strategy was to transform people by creating a new kind of community. And then, as he does this, he begins to send them out to do the same thing that he had done. As soon as he's ready, this is what happens next. Okay, so let's check out, we'll go a little further in our scriptures today. Let's check out a little bit of Matthew, okay? So he sends them out. He begins to train them to do the things that he has done. And then he starts to send them out. There's this famous place where he finally feels like they've been watching him do this all this time. They've been watching him do this work of restoring people's lives, deeply connecting with people in a way that no one had ever connected with them before, ways that were healing to them, of praying for people, of getting deep into their lives and releasing them from things. And they've started to participate with him in that work to some degree. And then at a certain point, he just grabs them and he sends them out. He sends them out to all of these towns and cities, he says, that he's about to go to. Okay, and so this is part of, in Matthew chapter 10, I'll read a little bit for you here starting at verse 7. Okay, Matthew chapter 10, he says this, these are the instructions he gives to them. As you go, proclaim this message. The kingdom of heaven has come near. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse those who have leprosy, and drive out demons. Freely you have received, freely give. Whatever town or village you enter, this is very important for his strategy. Whatever town or village you enter, search there for some worthy person and stay at their house until you leave. As you enter their home, give it your greeting. If the home is deserving, let your peace rest on it. And if it is not, let your peace return to you. Okay, so I want to point out here, the second point for your bulletin is this. It's Jesus built an intentional community. If you want to write this down, there's a fill in the blanks. You can write it down in your bulletin and help keep you engaged. He made a plan and he put it into action. Jesus did not. He is the Son of God, and he did not try to change the world on his own. He actually decided to try and change the world through people, and he made a very, very intentional, clear plan. He didn't write down his plan. He just told people about it. Actually, he didn't even tell them the whole strategy. He just started doing it. He makes a very clear plan, and he puts it into action. And this is something that we need to do. That's why we've done this as a church, or trying to do this as a church, as people who follow Jesus. We're trying to follow the same plan that he had. Because here's what he does, right? He builds that community, and then he sends these guys out. Once they've reached a certain point, he sends them out in pairs. So they're not alone, so they still got that deep relationship with someone else, okay? And then they're to go to all these towns where he's about to go. And you can see, if you read not even very much between the lines in this text, what they are looking for is kind of the same thing that Jesus was looking for. When he went up on that mountain, he prayed and he asked his Father, God, who should I choose to be these 12 who are closest to me? And remember I said he chose a very diverse group. He did have one sort of key characteristic that he was choosing here. He was looking for people who trusted him enough. He was looking for people who trusted him enough to actually follow his instructions. I think that's the key. And he says this over and over, and the word that he uses to describe that is what? Is faith. That's the word that he uses to describe that quality. He was looking for people of faith, people who trusted him enough that they would actually do the things that he says to do. Okay, he didn't really care about people who were just saying, yay, Jesus, we think you're so great. And then they'd go home and just continue their life exactly like it was before. Those kind of people he didn't pay much attention to. It was people who had faith, who had this quality that he could see that they would actually do. They trusted him enough to actually do what he was asking them to do. And he sends his guys out, and he has them looking for the same quality in other people. He's having them look for what, a lot of times we call these people of peace. They go into a town, and they're talking with people. They're telling this good news that Jesus was telling. They're basically preaching the same messages that Jesus had preached, and they're looking for how people respond. Are there people in this town who believe this, who are excited about this, who are into this enough that they'll actually follow the instructions? And then they're going back and reporting to Jesus who those people are. He's then showing up in their towns right after, and he's gathering those people together and commissioning them. How do we know that? We know that because in Luke chapter 10, we were just in Matthew chapter 10, in Luke chapter 10, after he sends out the 12, he sends them out to find these people of peace. What does he do in Luke chapter 10? After he sends out the 12, he sends out the 72. Let's take a look at that in Luke chapter 10. He sends out 72 people this time. Now, a question, and the question is never really explicitly answered in the New Testament, where did these 72 people come from? I'll tell you where they came from. The 12 who were sent out went and found these people in all the towns and villages. They found people who had this same quality of faith, of trust in Jesus and in his message. And then they built deep relationship with them. Jesus' whole strategy was to build this incredibly close relationship, to live with these people. And then he sends out these people that he's lived with to literally do the same thing. He says, go into a town. When you find one of these people, don't move around houses. Live with them. Stay with them the whole time. Why? They're doing the exact same thing Jesus was doing. Do you see it? And then he collects those people and he sends the 72 out to do the same thing. Let me read a little bit for you from Luke chapter 10. Starting at verse 1, it says this: after this, so after all that had happened, and the 12 had come back, and then Jesus had gone on further, the Lord appointed 72 others, and he sent them 2 by 2, the same way he sent the 12, to every town and place where he was about to go. Again, the same thing. And he says to them this: the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest to send out workers into his harvest field. Now that's a verse that many of us are familiar with. The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. But look at the context of that verse. God kind of smacked this into my face this week. I was stunned by it when I realized what the context is. The context, he's telling this to the 72 that he's sending out. What's he telling them? He's telling them your purpose is to go out and find more people that you can build into an intentional, deep community, just like my first 12 did with you, and just like I did with them. And you're going to build these new community groups. This is really what the church is. This is Jesus creating the church. The church is not a bunch of Sunday morning stuff. Not if you go by Jesus' definitions here. Sunday morning is an important time. It's important we get together. But that's not what it is. It's these groups of people that are deeply united together, that through their unity in God, are actually having their lives transformed deeply on the inside. And then as that happens, when they reach a certain stage, they can actually go out and begin to build deep relationships with others. New communities can be formed that will then transform more lives. And this is his whole strategy, literally to take over the world. This is his strategy as opposed to the strategy of Julius Caesar that we saw earlier. I came, I saw, I conquered. I'm going to kill everybody. That's my strategy. Jesus' strategy is to build these deep communities, and it's a strategy that takes a long time. It takes a really long time. It took him years just to make this happen with a few relatively small groups of people. But within 300 years, his strategy has totally taken over the Roman Empire. Within maybe 1,000 years, his strategy has radically changed the culture of an entire portion of the world. His strategy has given us gift after gift that we're living in right now that we don't even recognize most of the time. So third point for your bulletin is this. Jesus shows them how to live together. We're going to kind of sum it up here with this point, what Jesus is trying to do. He shows them how to live together. He teaches them how to restore people, and then he sends them out to change the world. He shows them how to live together. He teaches them how to restore people, and then he sends them out to change the world. You see, words alone are never going to change the world. I have definitely noticed this as someone who gets up and preaches most weeks for the last many years. You can get up here and you can say all the true words in the world, and for the most part, all that really matters is whether or not people are really putting that into practice in their lives, and whether or not those people have the right kind of deep community around them to enable them to get past the places where they're stuck. Otherwise, all the words that we say on Sunday morning really have very little effect. How many of you know people who have read the Bible their whole life? Even the Bible, which is an astonishing gift from God, truth, divine truth that can transform. But we've all known people who've read the Bible their whole lives and they still have bitterness, anger, unforgiveness. They still have places where they're stuck and they just can't get past it. So over this next while, we are going to be engaged. We are moving in our community groups. We're moving in our community groups to try and take this to a deeper level of what Jesus was actually putting into practice, okay? So the point of this message is not actually for you to just know the information in this message. The point of this is that you guys, most of you are in community groups right now. And this is the reality that we're trying to live out in our community groups. This is why you're going to be meeting one-on-one with your community group leaders. You'll be meeting as couples outside of community group time. Your leaders are going to ask you that soon if they haven't asked you already. And part of the point of that is exactly what Jesus was doing. Where are you at in your life? Where's the place you're stuck? Where's the place you're trying to follow God but you can't get past it? And you're going to have someone that you can talk to, have deep conversations with because you have a relationship, and you can move forward and they're going to pray for you, and we're going to bring divine power to bear on that. My friends, our church is actually incredibly well poised to be one of the places. There are many people in the world doing this, but to be a place that brings long-term, deep change to the world. Our church is actually incredibly well positioned for that. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Look around the room, okay? It doesn't matter that there's a bunch of empty seats or that we haven't filled this whole room. Did that matter to Jesus? I mean, of course he wanted more people to follow him. But what mattered most was what's going on in those communities. How are my closest followers actually learning to be who they should be on the inside? And how do they know how to go out and deeply connect with people in a way they've never been connected with before? To build new relationships and build new communities. That's the way that he knew, the only way to really change the world. Because you can't force people to change. You can't force people to change. They can only change when they choose to change and when they engage with others in the right way. So I'm going to leave you today just with a couple challenges. So if you've heard this message and you think, I hope you do, man, this is one of those messages where I struggled. Can I get across, Lord, can I get across the depth of my own longing for this? I yearn to see this brought into fuller and fuller reality among us and in the world around us. Man, when this came into reality through Jesus and his earliest followers, they changed the world. What could happen now if we embody this, if we live this out? But it's going to take all of us. It's going to take us, not just in community group, having a meal together and smiling and nodding when there's somebody in the room who we really can't stand what they're doing or they've offended us. It's going to take us digging into that and getting past it. It's going to take us actually learning how to love, in Jesus' way, those who are very, very different than us and we never would have naturally been best friends with, but reaching the point where we would die for them and they would die for us. If that could happen, oh my goodness, praise God. It would be an amazing day for us and for the world. So, if you're not part of a community group, my challenge to you is to join a community group. And if you are part of a community group, which most of you are, I won't make you raise your hand because I don't want to embarrass you if you're not. If you're not part of a community, or if you are part of a community group, my challenge to you is also to join a community group. My challenge to you is to really live out what community group is supposed to be. If you don't know what it's supposed to be, ask your leader. They're going to tell you because we've done a lot of training on this, what community groups are supposed to be. Really dig into it. Really build those relationships. Become deeply connected. We need to be real friends. Not just people who end up at the same place together and are friendly to each other in those places. We need to become real friends. Those who really genuinely love each other. And that is a place where it can happen if we all dig into it. Become a part of that group. The second one is this, right on the tail of it. Build a spiritual friendship. I know, and I think this is the reason that God has been pushing me and others in our church on this particular point. I know that many of you feel like you don't have any real close friendships, or that you don't have enough real close friendships. I have heard that from so many people in our church. You need to be intentional about building those friendships. God has provided people around you who can be your close friends, that brings life into your life and you pour life into theirs. He has provided those people. Believe it. Jesus didn't go looking for a particular kind of people, the best of the best. He went and found just the people who had enough faith, who were willing to follow him, and he transformed them. When you look around our church or your community group, don't think, oh, this is a bunch of people that I just can't get along with them. I just can't. Ugh. Don't believe that. It's a lie. These people are the people God has placed in your life, and you can build a spiritual friendship. So build that friendship. Talk with them. Build the relationship, and then talk with people about deep things. I had somebody recently in our church come to me and say, one time in my life in church, I had a conversation with someone that was just spontaneous, that was about something really deep and important. And it was amazing. And most of the time that doesn't happen. That's not the kind of community we're trying to build. That's not the kind of community that will change the world. We got to go after those deep conversations. We got to learn how to do it. Learn from Jesus how to do it. Let's pray together and then we'll continue in worship.